Hey everyone, it's Mr. Hefner again, and today I'm coming to you from this clean, well-lighted place, a nice cafe. I'd feel comfortable sitting here for a little bit of time. I'm coming to you from this clean, well-lighted place because today we're going to read a short story by Ernest Hemingway, and it happens to be called A Clean, Well-Lighted Place. So let's get started. I wish we had more time to spend with Ernest Hemingway in this class. We're going to spend a lot of time with Fitzgerald. They knew one another, and there are some letters we have going back between the two of them that their relationship wasn't always an equal one. Hemingway almost bullied Fitzgerald from time to time. Hemingway was, he had this image of being the all-time tough guy, a man's man, you know, somebody who would just dominate in many ways. And I don't know if we'll be able to get into it too much, but as we look at his short biography in this introduction, you might be able to draw some connections between the way he grew up and then the way he lived his life later. But for the most part, what I want to focus on as you guys read A Clean, Well-Lighted Place today is Hemingway's style. And so that's our lesson essential question today. What characteristics define Hemingway's writing? And we're going to look at that. And even though A Clean, Well-Lighted Place is a little less than a page and a half long, I think it's a really good example. And I'm glad this is the one that we have. If we can't do a whole lot of Hemingway, at least we have this one. So there's a younger Ernest Hemingway there on the About the Author, and we have a younger Ernest Hemingway sitting at his typewriter, probably in some exotic place of the world, writing some adventure story. You can see his dates, born in 1899, so he comes in at the end of the 19th century. Our last unit was Frontiers, and it ended in 1900. Those are always arbitrary numbers, but he's right at the end of that, and he makes it through World War II and into the 1960s. All right, so he's born in Illinois, Midwesterner, the heart of America kind of thing, to a doctor who's able to provide well to his family and a mother who's a music teacher. And I'm no family therapist or anything here, but what I know about the family is that the mother was extremely religious and very overbearing. She ran the household. And while there's probably nothing wrong with that, at the time period when Hemingway was Ernest, they're all Hemingways, but when Ernest was a young man, to see his mother running the house and the father almost being timid in front of her was a little bit of a problem. Plus, the father was extremely tough on Ernest. He would take him out, you know, when Ernest did something wrong, he would take him out behind the shed and get out the old belt. And there are stories that say that from time to time, Ernest would pick up his hunting rifle and point it at his dad without his knowing and just pretend to fire a shot. So there might have been some animosity in there. The father commits suicide. The doctor committed suicide. And I'm sure that's something then that later on affected the son, affected Ernest. He gets one of his first writing jobs as a reporter. A lot of writers at this time are going to get their jobs. He wrote for the Kansas City Star. The interesting thing, the important thing about this is that newspapers don't generally include long, flowery descriptions and lengthy developments. Newspapers are about the facts as simply and as clearly as you could state them. Newspapers are not generally about, using beautiful language, but using clear, direct language that everyone can understand. And we call that style of writing, we use the word spare, S-P-A-R-E. In other words, we're not using anything extra, we're using only what we need. And the way Hemingway cut his teeth as a writer, writing for newspapers and working as a war correspondent and things like that, really shows up in the way he wrote his fiction. Because while many writers were working on flowery language, Hemingway tried to cut everything down to just the most essential words. You'll see that when we read the story. He during World War I, he was an ambulance driver, as were some of the other writers that we're going to have in this unit. And it's interesting because he wanted to fight and finally got to the point where he could fight, got wounded, carried another soldier to safety. They both made it. Had a nurse that nursed him back, and she's going to become one of the characters in one of his novels later on that's sort of very similar to what actually happened to him on the battlefield. If you remember our introduction to this unit, we talked about the group of writers called the expatriates, the ones who believed that too many Americans just wanted simple, lowbrow entertainment, that they did not want art in their literature. And so they believed that Europeans were more cultured. And so he was one of those artists who moved off to the Riviera and Paris and wrote stories with the other writers while he was over there. He's an American writer, and he came back to America, but he did some of his writing overseas. He was a very adventurous guy. Now, maybe, just maybe, all right, like I said, I'm not a psychiatrist or anything like that. When Ernest Hemingway was a small child, his mother dressed him as a girl up until like the age of, I think it was 8. She dressed him as a girl, put him in dresses, put him in girls' shoes and things like that. Back in the Victorian time period, if we go back to, maybe the 1850s, that was common. Girls and boys were dressed the same. And then once a boy hit a certain age, you'd give him his first pair of pants and, recognize him as your son and things like that. I don't know, for Ernest Hemingway's mother, she would have remembered that from her youth, but she's in the wrong time period to be doing that to her son, Ernest. I don't know if this guy grew up, wanting to overcome that, to prove that he really is masculine, but Ernest Hemingway definitely led a man's life. He volunteered as war correspondent. He volunteered to drive ambulances and things like that. He was a big game hunter, going off to Africa, going on safaris and things like that. He was a champion fisherman, going off to the Caribbean to fish for sailfish, those gigantic swordfish type fish with the big fins on the back. In fact, at one point, he was a boxer too. Forgot about that. And he was quite a good boxer, because at one point he entered a fishing contest in this small town, and he won. And the people were upset that he was going to take their prize money away because he was an outsider. And he challenged. He said, "You get your best fighter. That person can take me on one-on-one, and if I win, I get the money." That's a pretty gutsy kind of thing to offer up. He won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction in 1953 for his novel, The Old Man and the Sea. But he had wanted a prize like this for a long time. He saw many of his friends, the other writers, were winning these awards, and he was not. Hemingway's works were sort of appreciated, maybe because they were too simple on the surface. Their complexity, which was hidden by that simplicity, didn't really get appreciated until later. And when you read some of the things he wrote in his lifetime, it almost seems like he was jealous of the success of some of his friends while he was trying to strive for that success himself. He also won the Nobel Prize in 1954. Now, the Pulitzer Prize is an American prize, and the Pulitzer Prize is given in a number of different categories. The Nobel Prize is an international prize, and so that one carries even more weight. And that was for The Old Man and the Sea as well. And then in 1953, before he won the Nobel Prize, he was involved in a plane crash. And he was injured, and it seemed to have affected him, perhaps his ability to concentrate or something. But after that plane crash, he's not quite the same person. He's not writing the kinds of stories he used to. He seems to become very, very worried about still being strong, being a man. And when you look at pictures of him after this, you can see him growing old very, very quickly. And unfortunately, in 1961, he took his own life. Now, this is something, I mean, you already know, as we talked about, his father took his own life. And then the son, Ernest, took his own life using the same gun that the father had used to take his life. Why they kept it around, I don't know. Just a couple images of Hemingway throughout his life. You can see him, there's that image of him at the typewriter there with the strong clouds behind him, strong mustache, dark hair, definitely an athletic type build to him writing away. You see the adventurer. He used to go on these safaris. By the way, I'm not a big fan of people who go big game hunting these days when I think that, such game is often endangered. But there's a really good nonfiction book that Hemingway wrote called The Green Hills of Africa. It's not usually touted as one of the must-read books, but it's an actual first-person account of Hemingway and one of his wives. I think he had three. He had a number of wives. Not all at the same time, though. Not all at the same time. On his safari. And it's really an exciting book to read. So if you're ever looking for an exciting book and you want to read something by a classic author, check out Green Hills of Africa. And on the right, then you look at the picture, this would be later on in life, and he definitely does not look like the same man. First of all, even the pose, standing with a double-barreled shotgun, posing like that, shirtless in what looks like a restroom or something. I don't know what's going on with that one, but you can definitely see there's been a change in Ernest Hemingway from the left side of this screen to the right. Now, his best-known novels, you're not going to be tested on these or anything like that. I just want you to see if what they are, and if you remember or have recognized the titles. There's A Farewell to Arms, and that's the one that's based on his experiences when he was an ambulance driver and got wounded, and then he was taken care of by his nurse, fell in love with her. This actually happened to him. Hemingway had a, he really fell in love with his nurse. I don't know how else to say it. And so A Farewell to Arms is a novel like that. Now, it's not a happy ending kind of novel. Most Ernest Hemingway stories are not romantic, even though there's love in them. They often take the idea that life isn't always fair. And in fact, I think it was Hemingway who wrote at one point, like life breaks everyone, and those who it cannot break, it kills. And that's a pretty dark outlook on the world. There's Death in the Afternoon. When Hemingway lived in Spain, he became completely enamored of the bullfighting that went on there. And he would go see it every day. In fact, I think it was their first son, but one of their sons, they named Nicanor after a famous bullfighter of the time. So this is a novel about bullfighting. And then there's For Whom the Bell Tolls. And this is a story about the Spanish Civil War. It's a story about an American who gets attached to someone who must sort of go behind enemy lines and do sabotage type bombings and things like that. And then finally, the book that he received the greatest award for, very, very short novel. I think it's around 100 pages in paperback, is The Old Man and the Sea. And you read between the lines in this and you really see Ernest Hemingway starting to think about age and what it means. And are men still men when they start to lose their strength and their abilities? And The Old Man in the Sea is a story about a fisherman who's grown old, and he hasn't caught a fish in a long time, not anything significant. And the people of the town start talking about him, and he's going downhill, and he goes on a fishing trip, and he catches a gigantic marlin, not a sailfish, but a marlin. I don't really know the difference between the two. And he's trying to bring this marlin back to just prove that he still has his manhood, but it's so big and it's so heavy, and he's by himself in this boat. It's really a cerebral kind of book. It's not so much about the adventure, but about the ideas of what it means to grow old. And that's a great transition to today's story, because A Clean, Well-Lighted Place is a story in which we have three characters. We have a young waiter, an older waiter, and an old man who's completely deaf, who comes out here because he's alone in the world. And this clean, well-lighted place, he likes to hang out, have a few drinks, and stay as long as he can. And the young waiter wants this old man out of here so he can go home. And the older waiter understands that this cafe provides something for people like this old man. And so we get to see what age is like from three different perspectives in the story. And it's one of Hemingway's earlier stories. So it's fascinating that even when Hemingway was young, he was contemplating the idea of what will it mean as I grow old. So your reader's journal here is, what special place do you go to when you want to be alone? And I hope you do want to be alone sometimes, right? It's not good if you want to be alone all the time, but I think human beings don't fully grow into themselves unless they get some time to spend with their thoughts, thinking about the world, processing things. And maybe it's your room, maybe it's a park that you go to. In the case of our story, it's going to be the cafe, the clean, well-lighted place that the old man comes to. All right, so this particular selection was published in 1933. You do not need to remember that date. So as I said, this is going to be, you know, what, 30, 29, 28 years before Hemingway dies. It was published in a collection of short stories. I have a scan of the cover of the book here called Winner Take Nothing. And you know the expression winner take all. So here's a little bit of Hemingway's outlook on the world coming through in the title here. And this collection of short stories established Hemingway as a master of short fiction. Most writers want to write the great American novel, and Hemingway wrote his novels. Most writers do not become famous for their short stories. We're going to do Fitzgerald. Hopefully you're already reading The Great Gatsby, and he's famous for his novels, but he was incredibly prolific when it came to writing short stories. But he's not famous for writing the short stories as he is the novels. Hemingway's a little different. Hemingway's short stories really get a lot of respect. He was a very admired writer at the time, very popular with readers, although the critics at first did not see the craft in what he was doing because of that spare writing style that I talked about before. A lot of his stories are told not through a narrator, not a narrator telling you this happens, this happens. They're told through dialogue. You have to listen to what the people are saying to one another in the story. Remember, dialogue is just speech between two or more characters. You have to listen to what the characters are saying to one another to figure out what's really going on. And when you read A Clean, Well-Lighted Place, it's going to be just simply the dialogue between the young waiter and the old waiter. The old man, you know, gets spoken to and, you know, he says a word here or there, but the dialogue really occurs between the older waiter and the younger waiter, and those are the perspectives you want to pay attention to in the story. Hemingway was a reporter, as I said, and reporters have to be quiet and watch and listen and observe. And Hemingway cut his teeth in his newspaper writing so that when he writes his stories, the subtleties of human behavior are what he's able to capture. And even though the writing style is simple, every word is carefully chosen. And you can look at times of, you know, wow, because this character said it this way, that shows me X, Y, or Z. So you really can get into looking at the intricacies of Hemingway's language, even though the language is simple on the surface. He's a true artist. And there's that word spare. So again, this is what I'm talking about. Hemingway does not use long, convoluted, compound sentences in the passive voice or anything like that. There's nothing about his language that is going to make you have to reread and figure out what that last sentence means. It's just like newspaper style. Sometimes people describe his work with the word nada, and nada is a Spanish word that means nothing. And it's not an insult. It's not saying Hemingway's work is nothing. But a lot of things you read, they might leave you feeling uplifted at the end, or they might leave you feeling drained or sad, or they might leave you feeling a little bitter about something. But Hemingway's have no feeling. You know, even when there's emotion or there should be emotion, you feel nothing. Things just happen, and it's very subjective. We talked about subjectivism, and so you're going to see that in this story. All right, the literary tools that are going to be important for this one, characterization and dialogue. So our characters aren't built in this story with a narrator describing them to a T. Our characterization is done through the ways our characters behave in the story and the things they say to one another in the story. So that's why I think it's great that they put character and dialogue together here, because we're going to have to listen to the dialogue to understand the important differences between the older waiter and the younger waiter. And then there's this stuff called internal monologue. So internal monologue is just a conversation inside a character's head. Right? If we were doing Shakespeare plays, we would talk about the idea of a soliloquy, where a character just thinks out loud, to be or not to be. But in a short story like this, we can just read it on the page. And there's going to be a part in our story where the older waiter and the younger waiter are no longer together, and the reader goes along with the older waiter. And we're going to be in the older waiter's head as he processes what just happened. So that's going to be called internal monologue. Also look for motif. So a motif is anything. It could be an idea, it could be a word, it could be a phrase, it could be a color, it could be a shape or an animal, anything at all that keeps coming up again and again and again in a work of literature. So as you look in here, look for something that you see just keeps getting mentioned again and again, and you'll have a motif there. All right, so as you read the story, these are the things you want to focus on. The dialogue between the older waiter and the younger waiter. Look for a theme. Now, I've already given you a good hint at the theme, and the theme is going to have to do with the idea of growing older and what it means and what we need at different stages of our life. And then appreciate, if you can, the stripped down style. You know, people have this idea that if I'm going to write, I have to make my language ornate and flowery. And Hemingway was exactly the opposite. Hemingway was about cutting your words down to the bare bone and letting the story, you know, come to the forefront, not the language. But his language, that doesn't mean his language isn't carefully chosen. Sometimes in order to say something in the most simple way, you need to very carefully evaluate how you build your sentence and pick just the right words. All right, so this is the point now that you should go read the story, because we're going to move into the discussion questions, the questions that you'll see on the check for understanding. If you just go with me now and copy them down, that's okay. But if you do these to take the quiz and then don't read the story, you're putting yourself at a disadvantage. Remember, the one thing you don't want to do with all the time you're spending in your education is to fight against getting an education. All right, let's go on with the questions. All right, some fill in the blanks here. Fill in each blank with the appropriate literary term. And we're not going to use them all because there are 5 and we only have 3 sentences. So A or an blank presents the private sensations, thoughts, and emotions of a character. We have characterization, personification, dialogue, alliteration, and internal monologue. And we just talked about it. That would be internal monologue. Having a character think on the page is internal monologue. How about number 2? Blank is the use of literary techniques to create a character. That's pretty easy. We call that characterization, making a character. And Hemingway's going to do that largely through dialogue. So you pay attention to that. Number 3, what is conversation involving 2 or more people? Well, we just said that's dialogue. All right. So dialogue is 2 or more people. Monologue is 1 person speaking. And when it's thinking, it's internal monologue. All right, our 3 characters here. Which one of these 3 characters, the old waiter, the young waiter, and the old man, wants to close the cafe early? And of course, that's always going to be the young person. I know you may have a job right now, and maybe you have a job, you know, working someplace that closes at 10, and there's always that person that comes in at 9:50 and won't leave, and nobody can go home until that person finally leaves, and you just want to get out of there. You're young. You've got a life to go home to. The one that considers his job important is the old waiter, because he knows that this cafe is where some people come, and we provide a service. And if we close early, then we can't provide that service to the people who need us. And of course, in this case, the kind of people who need this cafe are like the old man. He's a widower. His wife is gone. His niece takes care of him. And at one point in the story, he even tries to hang himself, and his niece finds him and cuts him down and saves his life. So it's the old man who has the niece that looks after him. Some true or falses here. True or false, the old man attempted suicide by hanging. Of course, I just said that. So that is true. The old man's wife saved him. No, I just told you it was his niece that cut him down. So that's false. And that's a stupid question to even put in the textbook, because those kinds of details don't matter. It would not affect the story one bit, one way or another, except that we know that the old man's a widower, so it cannot be his wife. Number 3, the young waiter wants the old man to leave immediately, and that's absolutely true. Get out of here, old man. I want to go home to my wife, and I want to go get some sleep tonight. Number 4, the old waiter hates his job. Absolutely false. He knows that his job provides a service to people who need it, and he knows he's going to be one of those people one day. You know, at least we can infer that, even though he doesn't say it outright. And so, no, he sees his job as important. And so you can't hate your job when you believe what you're doing is important. And number 5, the young waiter wants to go home to his wife. And that's absolutely true. He just wants to go home and be with his family. He doesn't see that he's fulfilling a service to anybody because he's not at that point in his life just yet. All right, so that's our introduction to Ernest Hemingway. You're going to find that my introduction was longer than the story. The story's a page and a half, so make sure that you read it. Hopefully you already did because you went through the check for understanding questions, but enjoy the story, number one. Number two, look beyond the surface. Look at the subtext. Look at what's being said in the dialogue and how that shows us who all of these characters are and what they're like. And then finally, try to appreciate Ernest Hemingway's spare style. Just because the language is simple and the sentences are short does not mean that this is a simplistic story. I hope I've turned you, or I hope maybe this story will turn you on to Hemingway so that you can try a little bit more, because if you haven't read a few pieces by Hemingway, you should. I'll see you next time.